The Soviet Union always wanted to gain a foothold in Afghanistan because the region is rich in natural resources such as gas, coal, uranium, and plutonium. In the 1960s, the Soviet government was also anxious about the spread of anti-communist Islamic ideas in Afghanistan that had begun to spread into the neighboring majority Muslim Soviet provinces of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Therefore, in the 1960s and 70s, the Soviet Union began funding communist propaganda in Afghanistan and began supporting local communist groups. However, as was the case in other Muslim countries, the atheist ideology of communism was largely rejected by the people. One of the first people to resist the influx of communist ideology into Afghanistan was Professor Ghulam Muhammad Niazi, who was a leading professor at Kabul University. Professor Niazi was educated at the Al-Azhar University in Egypt, where he was exposed to the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, who proposed the idea of a modern Islamic political system as an alternative to both capitalism and communism. After returning to Afghanistan, Professor Niazi began debating Afghan communists, and he became involved in political discussions regarding the future of Afghanistan. Professor Niazi also established a political party known as the Young Muslims, which aimed to establish an Islamic government in Afghanistan. The Young Muslims also attended a conference in Tashkent and expressed solidarity for Muslims living under Soviet oppression. Many of the students of Professor Niazi, such as Gulbuddin Hikmatyar and Burhanuddin Rabbani, later went on to resist the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Another prominent anti-communist activist during this period was the preacher known as Maulvi Muhammad Yunus Khalis, who wrote many anti-communist articles in newspapers as well as many books, such as the book entitled Social Justice in Islam. In April 1978, the Afghan president Daoud Khan was overthrown in a military coup backed by the Soviet Union and replaced with a communist government which was a puppet of the Soviets. Daoud Khan was killed along with his family. The new brutal communist government began to confiscate property and land. The communist land reforms were rejected by the Afghan people. Afghan peasants who had been granted land by the communist government refused to take the land as it did not belong to them, and they were happy with what God had given them. The communist government also arrested Afghan tribal and religious leaders who opposed the new communist land reforms. Many Islamic scholars and anti-communist intellectuals such as Ghulam Muhammad Niazi, Maulvi Habibur Rahman, and Dr. Muhammad Umar were executed. After witnessing these brutal executions, Afghans revolted against the Soviet-backed government. The Afghan people, who were deeply religious, fiercely independent, and heavily armed, launched a rebellion against the atheist communist government. Many Afghan rebel groups began violent uprisings against the oppressive communist government. In March 1979, dozens of Afghan military commanders such as Muhammad Ismail Khan, Alauddin Khan, and Safiullah Afzali defected from the army and began a rebellion against the communist government in the city of Herat. The people of the city also joined the rebellion. However, this rebellion was brutally crushed by the communist regime, and 25,000 people were massacred by the Afghan army. 2 months later, 10,000 anti-communist protesters were massacred by the Afghan army in the neighborhood of Chandiwal in Kabul. In August of the same year, an even larger rebellion took place in Kabul when a group of army defectors led by Faiz Ahmed revolted against the communist government and attempted to capture a strategic army base. After a bloody battle, the Afghan army managed to crush the rebellion after killing 1,000 rebels. The Afghan people eventually launched full-scale armed rebellions in various different regions of the country, and the situation became out of control. Many other rebellions took place against the communist government, such as the surprise attack led by the religious followers of Abul Ali Mazari, which killed 200 government soldiers in the Chahar Kint military base in the province of Balkh. In October 1979, President Noor Mohammad Taraki was assassinated and the communist government of Afghanistan had collapsed. Therefore, in order to try and secure their interests and reinstall a pro-Soviet government in the country, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. The Afghan rebels used guerrilla tactics against the Soviets. They launched raids and surprise attacks, then disappeared into the mountains, inflicting huge losses on the Russians. Although the Soviet army quickly occupied the Afghan capital of Kabul, they could not gain control of many other cities, towns, and rural areas. During the Soviet-Afghan War, 80% of the Afghan territory was outside Soviet control, and the Afghan rebels utilized the rugged Afghan mountains as the base for their resistance. In August 1980, the Afghan freedom fighters ambushed a Soviet force in the northern Badakhshan province, killing 49 soldiers. In April 1984, the Soviets suffered one of their greatest losses when a group of Afghan Mujahideen led by Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the son of a former Afghan army general, ambushed a Russian force in the Panjshir Valley, killing 58 Soviet soldiers. However, the Soviets had the advantage of advanced helicopters and planes, and they used indiscriminate bombing and chemical weapons against the Afghan people. Although the Afghan rebels did not have access to any aircraft, they received rocket launchers and anti-aircraft guns from Iran and Pakistan, and the high mountains provided them with a great base to shoot down helicopters and warplanes. In 1985, the Afghan Mujahideen managed to kill Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Levchenko after they destroyed his aircraft with a rocket launcher in the Salang Pass in northern Afghanistan. In eastern Afghanistan, Pashtun tribes that live on both sides of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border also participated in the resistance against the Soviet army. Thousands of tribal fighters crossed the border into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. Many Afghan rebel leaders such as Jalaluddin Haqqani, who had tribal connections on both sides of the border, were able to mobilize thousands of tribesmen in Pakistan to join the jihad against the Soviets. Many Pakistani volunteers from other regions of Pakistan also crossed the border and joined their Muslim brothers in the fight against the atheist invaders. For example, Muhammad Sajjad Kashmiri and many other Pakistani volunteers traveled to Afghanistan. The Pakistani government of General Zia-ul Haq also provided military training and funding to various Mujahideen groups. In addition to this, the Pakistani army sent hundreds of their soldiers to Afghanistan to fight alongside the Afghans in key battles against the Soviets. On April 21st, 1985, Afghan rebels led by Jalaluddin Haqqani ambushed a group of Soviet soldiers in the Maravar Pass in eastern Afghanistan, killing 31 Soviet soldiers, including Captain Nikolai Srebuk. The Soviet army was astonished by the brave resistance of the Afghan people, and more high-ranking Russian generals began to be killed in Afghanistan. In October 1987, the Afghan Mujahideen ambushed a group of Soviet soldiers in the eastern Zabul province, killing 12 soldiers, including Lieutenant Oleg Petrovich. The Soviets were also shocked by the resistance in western Afghanistan. The recent Islamic revolution in Iran caught the world by surprise, and the new Iranian government began funding Afghan rebel groups and pouring a constant supply of weapons into western Afghanistan. Therefore, the Tajiks of western Afghanistan began forming their own resistance groups under the leadership of rebel leaders such as Ismail Khan. Meanwhile, in central Afghanistan, the Hazara population also formed their own resistance groups and rallied around religious and tribal leaders such as Abul Ali Mazari. Many other Afghans across the country formed their own anti-Soviet resistance groups. Tribal leaders such as Mullah Naqibullah, preachers such as Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, engineers such as Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, and Sufi leaders such as Sigbatullah Mujaddidi formed their own resistance groups, as well as the neighboring Muslim countries of Iran and Pakistan. Many other Muslim nations showed their solidarity to the Afghan people. For example, Saudi Arabia raised huge sums of money to support the Afghan people and sent $20 million per month to the Afghan Mujahideen. Besides Muslim governments, many fundraising campaigns were conducted by individuals across the Muslim world. Activists such as Qazi Hussain Ahmed from Pakistan, Dr. Abdul Majid Zindani from Yemen, and Sheikh Abdullah Azzam from Palestine raised millions of dollars and sent it to the Afghan freedom fighters, and also encouraged fighters from their own countries to join the jihad. In addition to this, hundreds of Muslim soldiers in the Soviet army, such as soldiers from Central Asian provinces, Tatarstan, and the Caucasus, also defected to the Mujahideen and turned against the Soviet army. The Afghan Mujahideen inflicted huge losses on the Soviets and had the support of the entire population, who provided them with food and shelter and allowed them to move freely across villages. Therefore, the Soviets targeted civilians. Afghan villages were subjected to napalm bombing, which burnt crops and destroyed irrigation systems. More than 1 million Afghans lost their lives, and 5 million Afghans fled to Pakistan and Iran. More than half of the agricultural lands in Afghanistan were destroyed as a result of the bombing, and 15 million mines were laid on the ground by Soviet forces. However, despite this brutality, the Afghans continued to resist and continued to kill Soviet invaders. In the year 1989, Afghan fighters achieved decisive victories over the Soviet forces, forcing them to withdraw on 15th February 1989. Over 14,000 Soviet invaders were killed, and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev decided it was time to get out of Afghanistan, as there was no victory in sight. The Soviet-Afghan War was the longest war in Soviet history, and it is considered one of the important factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.